Hi, everyone. Welcome to Why They Write, Three Masters of Nonfiction on Poverty, Propaganda, and Lies. My name is Ilya Marritz. I'm a longtime public radio reporter. I also cover democracy for ProPublica. But my real qualification for being here in the host seat is that I am married to the founder of the Deepwater Festival. Aaron Hicklin, also very good friends with his co-director, Lucy Taylor. And just a brief, weird detour by way of kind of introducing the idea for this panel. When Aaron and I decided to get married about 9 years ago, we were both just huge Orwell admirers, and we felt that we should have a reading from Orwell at our wedding. And 1984, there are some love scenes in 1984, but that seemed all wrong. And so I went to the essays. You know, we have like the complete kind of nonfiction of George Orwell, and I was just reading everything and coming up with absolutely nothing. So if anybody is thinking of an Orwell reading for their wedding, I can tell you, forget it. Like, go back to Corinthians. No, what Orwell liked to write about was the lives of miners and waiters and hobos. He was interested in comic books. He was interested in toads, as we all know, and popular culture and war and propaganda and lies. And he is still so relevant today to so many of the journalists that I admire most, both for what he tells us about what people should be writing about and also how to write. He says in the essay Politics in the English Language, never use a long word when a short one will do. Never use the passive voice when you can use the active. If you can cut a word, cut it. These are like precepts that those of us who like do the craft reasonably well try to stick to. These ideas still matter. And we have three writers here today who I think go far beyond just cutting superfluous words. They are really incredible reporters. So let's welcome them on stage. Azmat Khan, Peter Pomerantsev, Barbara Demick. So Peter Pomerantsev worked as a TV documentary producer in Russia in the early 2000s. He then wrote a book about the experience called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. It is really sinister and really entertaining. I highly recommend it. His latest book is This Is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the War Against Reality. He's a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins, where he directs the ARENA program investigating the roots of disinformation. Azmat Khan, next past Peter, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who exposed the true cost of America's drone warfare program in the pages of the New York Times. She not only reported on the ground, from places like Iraq, she unlocked a vast trove of Pentagon documents that the Department of Defense did not want her or you to see, and proved that the supposedly surgical drone warfare program that we had during the war on ISIS was anything but, and was actually killing lots and lots and lots of civilians. So amazing reporting. Lastly, Barbara Demick, immediately to my left, is a foreign correspondent, author of 3 remarkable nonfiction books, all about the lives of regular people in troubled parts of the world. Eat the Buddha is about Tibet. Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea is about North Korea. And Logovina Street, Life and Death in a Sarajevo Neighborhood, coming off the war in Bosnia. Her books read like novels. If you haven't read one, do yourself a favor, pick one up. There is romance, there are dramatic escapes, there are people forced to make terrible choices, and it's all true. Also, she sometimes teaches a course at Princeton University. Is this true? Called Covering Repressive Regimes? Yeah. Yikes. Okay, we'll talk about that. I've already misplaced the first card, but it doesn't matter, because Barbara, you told me on email that you don't like to use the word Orwellian. I guess you think it's been, actually your mic should be in good shape as it is. Yeah. You don't like to use the word Orwellian, but you have covered some of the most, I think, other people would say Orwellian situations imaginable, trying to figure out what life is like in closed zones of North Korea and Tibet. Tell me about that.
I mean, Orwellian is just, I feel, overused, and it's not even really his name. We don't say Blairian, Blairish. But I don't like generic words in general. Like, I really avoid the word genocide, although obviously there is. I was talking to Peter about war crimes and definitions, but I want to say this is what happened. I avoid massacre. I avoid torture. Like, what is it? Just state the facts and the actual experience.
And why is that?
And I think it's just much more powerful. And for example, when I was writing about Tibet, some of the readers I had in mind were Chinese people who knew nothing about Tibet and nothing about the experiences of Tibet. So just having the voice, especially the voice of somebody who experienced something as a child, or an ordinary non-combatant, is much more powerful. And it's much more powerful when you see the horror. Well, and it's also one of the, this is a cliche in journalism schools, but the show, don't tell. So, yeah.
It still works.
Yeah.
Do you have a passage to read for us?
Yes. I have been wallowing in indecision. But I'm going to read.
Beforehand, Barbara was like, Tibet, North Korea, Tibet, North Korea. How did you decide?
I just decided Tibet because it's more recent, and one of the tricks here is writing books about genocide or massacres without it seeming to be the case. And so, Nothing to Envy, the North Korea book, opens as a love story. And this book opens as a story about a princess. What could be sweeter than a story about a princess? This takes place in 1958, and large portions of Tibet had their own independent kingdoms, and it's quite short. 1958, this is the beginning of a chapter called The Last Princess. Gompa could smell the smoke before she could see what was happening. Although she was just 7 years old and not well versed in the politics of the day, it confirmed a nagging feeling that she'd had for weeks that something was amiss. Okay. China analysts often speak of an implicit bargain that the Communist Party has made with the Chinese people: economic growth for their acceptance of one-party rule. The Communist Party is trying the same formula with Tibetans, and it might have even worked, since many Tibetans I've met are genuinely appreciative of the economic gains achieved under 70 years of Communist Party rule. It's not entirely propaganda. Tibetans don't want to go backwards. If only the Chinese government offered Tibetans the same terms of the deal that they do to Han Chinese. Not the rights offered in democratic countries, elections, or even freedom of speech, but the fundamental rights that have been offered to some Chinese citizens: the right to travel freely in their country, the right to get passports, the right to have their kids educated abroad, the right to travel abroad themselves, the rights to study their own language, the right to display portraits of their leaders. A Tibetan businessman, one of the entrepreneurs who rebuilt Naba, that's the town I wrote about, in the 1980s, and is now an affluent man, expressed it most memorably and succinctly. This is a man with 2 homes, 2 cars, a late model Japanese SUV, the latest model of iPhone and iPad. But despite decades of trying, despite the lack of any arrest records, he has been unable to obtain a passport. I have everything I might possibly want in life but my freedom. I'm just reading that short passage. That's from the conclusion of the book. It's not my style of writing is to tell a story. That's the most expository you get. But it sums up a lot of my feelings about minorities, Tibetans, and Uyghurs in China. They don't have the same deal.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason they're upset. And even the ones who are successful and generally non-political, don't.
And they know that they don't have the same deal.
They know they don't have the same deal. Yeah.
Peter, I want to talk to you next because I think your career began in a really interesting place that has some interesting resonances with Orwell, actually, where Orwell talks in the essay Why I Write about how he kind of always knew that he was going to be a writer, wanted to be a writer, but did all these other things before he actually ended up becoming a writer. You were a TV producer in Russia for many years, documentary TV producer. I think a lot of us can imagine what that might look like in the United States. What does that look like in Russia?
So that's very kind of you to elevate me to documentary producer. No, I did the dirtiest job you can do after having quite a nice education, which is I went and worked in reality TV. I was like I went to the dark place. And I had actually, to make it even worse, I'd been to film school in Moscow before that, dreaming of being an auteur film director, and then finding out very quickly that I was going to work in reality TV. And the reason I actually stayed in Russia to do it was, I was finding Russia, at that point, this was mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, fascinating, in the way that one finds evil fascinating. I was still young and drawn to evil in some ways. But also for the very pragmatic reason that the TV industry was booming, and instead of being an assistant, as I would have been in London, I could essentially be a sort of deputy showrunner. I worked on pure entertainment shows, and it was the most amazing sociology to understand the country. I actually think that it's not an accident that, Trump or Zelensky, who are polar opposites, but that they both came out of entertainment TV. You learn so much about a society. These days I do a lot of sociology to try to understand why propaganda works. I learned way more as a TV producer. So the production company I worked for, they made the Russian version of The Apprentice, which is a show that has political resonance in America as well. But it was very interesting because, The Apprentice is a show that works everywhere. Every country goes to, it works. In Russia, it flopped. Complete failure. And the question was why? Because they made it very well. Like, American and British and Dutch producers made the show. They had a real oligarch, not this kind of weird guy who fiddles his taxes that you guys had running it. Like proper oligarch, Batanin, really scary guy who owns the world's iron or something. Really well cast, great music, complete flop. Because for Russians, that wasn't how you make money. You don't make money by sort of having a brilliant business idea and then developing it and pitching it to banks. That you end up in prison if you do that. You make money by corruption, murder, extortion. So the reality shows that worked very well were ones like Survivor. You put people on an island, you're horrible to them and they have to survive. Russians are like, oh, the gulag, this is our thing. And I think it's still going. So
what does it say about me that I love Survivor?
Yeah, well, you have some Czech roots, it's there. It's there in all of us. That's well, actually, to make things serious, we're in the middle of a genocidal war, so it's not that funny. When Putin tells Russians, we're going to enjoy the pain. Yes, they're going to sanction us, but we like that. It is textbook masochism. So a society that has learned to enjoy at least the rhetoric of suffering after having been both subjected to and subjecting others to it. So there is something actually very creepy behind Survivor's high ratings. Something quite creepy, it turns out, behind Trump's high ratings. But let's stick to Russia. So I learned a lot about society through that. But I turned to writing because I realized to talk about those things, you have so much more freedom as a writer. In TV, you're very much chained to whatever the TV bosses want.
You have a short passage for us, yes?
Yeah, which has nothing to do with TV. That's my first book is all about that. My second book, actually, is one of these books where you run around the world and blow
like
your...
Like The Amazing Race? What are we talking about?
Blow
like
your
The Amazing
advance.
Race? Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, no, more like sort of Mafia, where you sort of run around the world and go to lots of countries for a few days. And I was trying to make sense of contemporary propaganda. So I was in the Philippines and Mexico and lots of other places, really trying to see whether the things that I'd seen in Russia were universal. But it was funny, after I'd run around the world, I realized to make sense of the present, I needed the past. So I did this strange thing, and I still remember emailing my editors and going, I'm going to make this a family memoir as well. And in the middle of this contemporary book, there's a family memoir about my parents and their time in Soviet Ukraine. And so I'll read a bit from the start, which is, I think fits with our Orwellian themes. I'll use that word, Barbara, I'm so sorry.
I can mic you if you would like. You look comfortable, though. Okay.
I think I feel a bit like awkward, like you were like, Jeeves,
Like
and I'm like,
over you.
Worcester,
All right.
like, hello, sir. Okay. He came out the sea and was arrested on the beach. 2 men in suits standing over his clothes as he returned from his swim. They ordered him to get dressed quickly, pull his trousers over his wet trunks. On the drive, the trunks were still wet, shrinking and turning cold, leaving a damp patch on his trousers in the back seat. He had to keep them on during the interrogation. There he was, trying to keep up a dignified facade, but the dank trunks made him squirm. It struck him they had done it on purpose. They were well versed in this sort of thing, these mid-ranking KGB men, masters of the small-time humiliation, the micro-mind game. He wondered, why had they arrested him here in Odessa, and not where he lived in Kiev? Then he realized that they had wanted a few days by the seaside. In between interrogations, they would take him to the beach to go swimming themselves. One would sit with him while the other would bathe. One time, an artist took out an easel and began to paint the three of them. The colonel and major grew nervous. They were KGB and they weren't meant to have their images recorded during an operation. Go have a look at what he's drawing, they ordered their prisoner. He went over and had a look. Now it was his turn to mess with them a little. Now, he's not drawn a good likeness of me, but you've come out very true to life. He had been detained for proliferating copies of harmful literature to friends and acquaintances, books censored for telling the truth about the Soviet Gulag or for being written by exiles. After 6 days, he was permitted to go home to Kiev, but the investigation continued. While he was on the way home after work at the library, a black car pulled up and he was taken for more interrogations. Everyone prepared for the worst. His mother-in-law taught him a secret code based on sausages. If I bring sausages sliced right to left, it means we've been able to get out news of your arrest to the West, and it's been broadcast on the radio. If I slice them left to right, it means we failed. Based, it is my father's story. It is my father's story. No, they're in the book. But really, it's not a memoir in the classic sense. I use them as a way to talk about how propaganda has changed between the Soviet times and now, and what stayed the same. So, I ran around the world, saw what was new, and I needed to contrast it with the 20th century. My parents, so my father was arrested and then exiled, which was quite typical in the 70s. There was a policy of exiling dissidents rather than shoving in. There was one labor camp left then in Mordovia. So I grew up in London. They left when I was 9 months old. So all I really had time to do was throw up all over the Soviet Union and then leave. But then I went back and rediscovered the joys of Putin's version of the Kremlin's political system, and had to discover it all for myself.
Azmat, you told me before we started that for you, a foundational Orwell essay is Shooting an Elephant. For people who don't know it, the title describes what happens. George Orwell is in Burma. He's a colonial official. An elephant goes wild in the town where he's posted, and people come to him and say, you have to shoot the elephant. And he doesn't really want to, but the crowd grows and grows. And I think somebody hands him a rifle, and there comes this point of inevitability, and he goes and he shoots and kills the elephant, and it ends with the really damning line, "I often wondered whether any of the others grasped that I had done it solely to avoid looking a fool." We Americans would say looking like a fool, but why does this essay mean so much to you?
I mean, it's one of a few, and I think in some ways it so clearly identifies imperialism and its insidiousness, because the character that he's describing is someone who very openly at the beginning says, I was actually with this local population. I didn't think we should be there. And yet he became this thing that he criticized so deeply. And it's just a beautiful rendering of that. And, I grew up, I was in high school when the Iraq War started, and I saw the ways in which that war was described by our government officials and in the press, and then the reality that unfolded as that war continued and the reverberations it's had over the last 20 years. And there are so many colonial connotations to wars like that. That piece of writing is one of a few. I would say like the most impactful for me is actually, I don't know how well known it is. It's called You and the Atom Bomb. And it was something that Orwell wrote after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was such an interesting, it wasn't like a simple look at, here's nuclear war, here is what the threat of this is, here's what deterrence it is. It's actually a look at what this new technology did to actually make things even more unequal. He essentially sets out to say that it will be a few countries that will have these capabilities, and it brings power into their hands, and there are fewer equal battles. And in so many ways, I can see connotations to the way that we conduct war today, primarily via airstrikes. Like which countries, which citizens, which groups have the ability to have that kind of aerial power, and what does that result in? And it was that kind of inequality and how anti-democratic he described it as being that I can see parallels to today.
I'd love to hear a passage from something that you chose to bring as well.
Sure. Okay, this is from, this is actually, I wanted to bring something that might set up some of the characters and people, and this is one that, I published The Uncounted in 2017 in the New York Times Magazine, and this is a character from that who, in so many ways, he was the beginning of a lot of this work for me. Late on the evening of September 20th, 2015, Bassem Razo sat in the study of his home on the eastern side of Mosul, his face lit up by a computer screen. His wife Mayada was already upstairs in bed, but Bassem could lose hours clicking through car reviews on YouTube. The BMW Alpina B7, the Audi Q7. Almost every night went like this. Bassem had long harbored a taste for fast rides, but around ISIS-occupied Mosul, the auto showrooms sat dark, and the family car in his garage, a 1991 BMW, had barely been used in a year. There simply was nowhere to go. The Razos lived in the woods, a bucolic neighborhood on the banks of the Tigris, where marble villas sprawled across amid forests of eucalyptus, chinar, and pine. Cafes and restaurants lined the riverbanks, but ever since the city fell to ISIS the previous year, Bassem and Mayada had preferred to entertain at home. They would set up chairs poolside and put kebabs on the grill, and Mayada would serve pizza or Chinese fried rice, all in an effort to maintain life as they'd always known it. Their son Yahya had abandoned his studies at Mosul University and fled for Erbil, and they'd not seen him since. Those who left when ISIS took over could re-enter the caliphate, but once there, they could not leave, an impasse that stranded people wherever they found themselves. Birthdays, weddings, and graduations came and went, the celebrations stockpiled for that impossibly distant moment, liberation. Next door to Bassem's home stood the nearly identical home belonging to his brother, Mohamed, and his wife, Azza. They were almost certainly asleep at that hour, but Bassem guessed that their 18-year-old son, Najib, was still up. A few months earlier, he was arrested by the ISIS religious police for wearing jeans and a T-shirt with English writing. They gave him 10 lashes and, as a further measure of humiliation, clipped his hair into a buzz cut. Now he spent most of his time indoors, usually on Facebook. Someday it'll all be over, Najib had posted just a few days earlier. Until that day, I'll hold on with all of my strength. Sometimes, after his parents locked up for the night, Najib would fish the key out of the cupboard and steal over to his uncle's house. Bassem had the uncanny ability to make his nephew forget the darkness of their situation. He had a glass half-full exuberance, grounded in the belief that every human life, every setback and success, every heartbreak and triumph is written by the 40th day in the womb. Bassem was not a particularly religious man, but that small article of faith underpinned what seemed to him to be a truth, even in wartime Iraq. Everything happens for a reason. It was an assurance he offered everyone. Yahya had lost a year's worth of education, but in exile, he'd met and proposed to the love of his life. You see, Bassem would tell Mayada, you see, that's fate. Bassem had felt this way for as long as he could remember. A 56-year-old account manager at Huawei, the Chinese multinational telecom company, he studied engineering in the 1980s at Western Michigan University. He and Mayada lived in Portage, Michigan, in a tiny one-bedroom apartment that Mayada also used as a headquarters to work as an Avon representative. She started small, offering makeup and skin cream to neighbors, but soon expanded sales to Kalamazoo and Comstock. Within a year, she saved up enough to buy Bassem a $700 Minolta camera. Bassem came to rely on her ability to impose order on the strange and the mundane, to master effortlessly everything from Yahya's chemistry homework to the alien repartee of faculty picnics and Rotary clubs. It was fate. They'd been married now for 33 years. Around midnight, Bassem heard a thump from the second floor. He peeked out of his office and saw a sliver of light under the door of the bedroom of his daughter, Tuka. He called out for her to go to bed. At 21, she would often stay up late, and though Bassem knew that he wasn't a good example himself and that the current conditions afforded little reason to be up early, he believed in the calming power of an early-to-bed, early-to-rise routine. He waited at the foot of the stairs, called out again, and the sliver went dark. It was 1 a.m. when Bassem finally shut down the computer and headed upstairs to bed. He settled in next to Mayada, who was fast asleep. Sometime later, he snapped awake. His shirt was drenched, and there was a strange taste, blood on his tongue. The air was thick and acrid. He looked up. He was in the bedroom, but the roof was nearly gone. He could see the night sky, the stars over Mosul. Bassem reached out and found his legs pressed just inches from his face by what remained of his bed. He began to panic. He turned to his left, and there was a heap of rubble. "Mayada," he screamed. "Mayada." It was then that he noticed the silence. "Mayada," he shouted. "Tuka." The bedroom walls were missing, leaving only the bare supports. He could see the dark outlines of treetops. He began to hear the faraway, unmistakable sound of a woman's voice. He cried out, and the voice shouted back, "Where are you?" It was Aza, his sister-in-law, somewhere outside. "Mayada's gone," he shouted. No, I'll find her." No, she's gone," he cried back. "They're all gone."
That's so powerful, and it is that family, Bassem's family, and Bassem in specific, who becomes sort of the central figure in the quest, really, to understand the impact of America's drone wars in Iraq. Tell me a little bit about how you and he worked together to unlock this massive, the records pertinent to the strike that killed many of his family members, and also thousands of other records from the drone war.
So, I worked on The Uncounted with a sociologist named Anand Gopal, and in addition to telling the story of Bassem, I was trying to do a sample of airstrikes and, trying to understand how many were resulting in civilian deaths. And just to give you a sort of understanding of that sample of 103 airstrikes in these 3 areas formerly held by ISIS, while the coalition's numbers were that 1 in every 157 airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death, our sample found that 1 in 5 was. That's not like 2 times higher, 3 times higher, that was 31 times higher. And so you want to know, how is this going so wrong? And with Bassem, I was able to get, there was a video uploaded to YouTube showing the bombing of his home. And they were part of these videos that the coalition put out, trying to show how successfully the war against ISIS was going. And they called it a car bombing factory. And because of that video, I was able to trace this back to the coalition and put in this Freedom of Information Act request and ultimately get my hands on what went wrong. And, when I gave Bassem the document, he was just blown away. It described how they most likely confused his house for a structure next door, which ISIS had previously occupied, but that they'd filmed the house in 30-minute windows for a total of about an hour and 45 minutes. They saw no women or children, but they were filming during the hottest hours of day. They saw no overtly nefarious activity. They saw nobody brandishing weapons, but ISIS does not obviously brandish weapons so as to go undetected. And they also said that they saw somebody open a gate for a car to come in, which was an ISIS tactic, technique, and procedure. Not just you have a gate, and in order for your brother to come to your house, you have to open the gate. Like everything that this family did, it was as though like it was up to them to prove to a drone flying above that they were innocent. They were guilty until they could prove otherwise. And so he gets this, and he's blown away, and he's disappointed, and I just want to know, how often does this happen? And so, I began making the same arguments using the Freedom of Information Act. I began requesting the thousands of others of assessments that had supposedly been done. And it was, I had to sue the Pentagon and U.S. Central Command, but starting in 2018 and over the next several years, every month or every other month, I was getting batches of records, so 300 pages at a time, amounting to, nearly 6,000 pages. And, what they showed was so much worse than, what I'd envisioned. Actually the strike that happened to Bassem, that met a higher threshold, that went through greater vetting than most of the others I saw. So in 1,300 of these kinds of assessments, not in a single one did they find a finding of wrongdoing or disciplinary action for anyone involved. They were rife with examples of confirmation bias, like the seeing an opening of a gate as evidence that you're ISIS, or, seeing someone, like with the Kabul strike, which you're familiar with, holding bottles of water but seeing that as, explosives, things like this. And it was just filled with example after example of that, and very few efforts to learn what went wrong and why. And ultimately, as I looked at this, they're clearly going through work to do these, and yet what they showed was that they're following a system very meticulously, but it was almost as though this was a system intended to function to legitimize these strikes, to expand their use, but also to give psychological comfort to those involved and give legal cover to those involved. And in so many ways, they showed that this was not actually about necessarily preventing civilian casualties like they claimed. It was more about providing that kind of cover.
I have a million questions about that, but I also want to turn back to Barbara, because I think something that both of your reporting has in common is that you kind of only do hard stories, basically. Like here, you have to go to Iraq, talk to people, figure out what they are seeing, and then figure out what the records are that you can contrast with it. Barbara, in your case, as you were telling the story of this town in, I guess it's in Sichuan province, but a Tibetan part of Sichuan province, foreigners kind of weren't really allowed there, and you would probably stick out quite a bit as a foreigner, and yet you managed to write a very detailed book about real people living there and how they had lived there. Many of them had also left Gaba, is that how you say the name of the town?
It depends on your dialect, but yeah, call it Naba.
Okay, I don't have a dialect, so great. What is your method? How do you do that?
I mean, I think it's, reporting from the inside and the outside. I mean, similar to what Azmat did. You looked at, U.S. records, you reported on the ground. In the case of my North Korea book took place in a city that I've never been to. It was a closed city. I've been to other parts of North Korea, but never this one. In the case of the Tibetan town.
And the North Korea book is based on accounts with dozens of people who fled.
Defectors. And I mean, other observations that I saw in, in other parts of North Korea. But I picked, very deliberately a city that was not part of the Potemkin village, that is Pyongyang, or, the very highly manicured parts of North Korea shown off to foreigners. In the case of Tibet, I did pick deliberately probably the toughest town to go to. Naba was the site of these self-immolations, and it had become, really like the epicenter of the resistance to Chinese communist rule, and I think it was the hardest place in Tibet to report. I mean, this is kind of complicated. It's not in the Tibet Autonomous Region where you need a special permit on top of your visa to go. But a lot of tourists go to Lhasa, not journalists, but regular tourists can go there, and there's a lot of accounts from Lhasa. But this part of Tibet, which had been really at the heart of the resistance for years, decades, really going back to the 1930s, was it was tough, and a lot of journalists tried to go. My friend Holly Williams from CBS, who's this gorgeous blonde, very tall, very very tall reporter for The Guardian, who was like hunched up in his car, and I'm actually very good at sneaking. Maybe I'm like an older woman, so I'm kind of invisible, but.
Are you wearing dark glasses? I mean,
I had when I went in actually many times. I didn't wear dark glasses. I wore a really ugly hat with polka dots on it, and it was like the kind of hat no foreign correspondent would ever wear. A friend of mine called it my vanishing hat, I didn't want to wear a Tibetan costume because that would be too
you call attention to yourself so as to evade attention.
I wore kind of like a longish skirt and kind of old clothes, and I tended to go out at night. At that time, this was pre-COVID. People wore a lot of face masks because of the dust and the sun. So I did reporting, in the town itself. I did a lot of reporting with exiles who were living in India or Nepal, some inside parts of China. There was very little paperwork on the town, but there was some work done by a Chinese investigator.
How did you go about just talking to people? I don't know if you speak Chinese. I don't know if they speak Chinese. How did you go about meeting people who are going to be characters in your stories?
That actually was
Were you wearing the polka dot hat?
Yeah, the polka dot hat really did well. If I don't have it with me, but I'd show you the pictures. I met somebody my first trip there asking for directions. He's actually the person who said, I have everything I want in life but my freedom. I met him in a dumpling shop, and I was just asking how to get to, I was asking how to get to the palace of the princess, the former palace of the princess. And he became very helpful and introduced me to quite a few people, a man who shall not be named. I met exiles in Dharamsala, India, which is where the Dalai Lama lives. And then they introduced me to their families who were still inside. And you learn to travel discreetly.
Because I would imagine you would not want to call attention to your sources and put them in any danger. That's the fear.
That's the biggest fear. Because nothing would happen to me. I'd maybe get deported, but at that point, I'd been in China long enough that getting kicked out would be okay. The language was very difficult. The Tibetan is the toughest language I've ever studied, and I didn't get very far. And in Naba, they spoke a dialect of Tibetan that was also very difficult. So I usually worked in Chinese. My Chinese is not very good, but a lot of the Tibetans didn't speak such great Chinese either. They had flat tones. I would often interview in Chinese, sometimes with a news assistant, Chinese news assistant, sometimes not. First couple of trips I traveled with a Tibetan, but that was really too frightening because she could have gotten into so much trouble that it was better to travel with a Chinese person.
Because an ethnic Chinese person.
An ethnic Chinese person. I used an ethnic Chinese driver who he just wouldn't have gotten in as much trouble. As I say, everything you hear about the problems that Han Chinese or the majority have, it's in triplicate for ethnic minorities. So it was, and I sometimes did interviews in Chinese, and then I taped them and said, okay, tell me that in Tibetan, and then I, sent it to be translated. I mean, it was very tricky.
That's pretty painstaking work.
The language was very tough. Yep.
Peter, I know you speak the local languages in Ukraine. What are you doing these days in Ukraine? You said the air raid sirens reminded you of it. I know that propaganda is your interest specifically. So are you covering the war, or are you studying propaganda? What are you doing there?
When the invasion started, I teamed up together with the war reporter Janine Di Giovanni and Natalia Gumenyuk, who is a very famous Ukrainian journalist. And we created an NGO called the Reckoning Project. And the idea is quite a simple one, actually, but maybe one that hasn't really been done before, which is putting journalists and lawyers together. So we have a team of about 15 to 30 journalists, Ukrainians, on the ground, collecting witness statements of war crimes. And then we have a team of lawyers who are actually Syrian, because they've been working on similar things in Syria.
The lawyers are Syrian themselves.
The lawyers are Syrian. So
okay.
The journalists are Ukrainian, the lawyers are Syrian, and then and then there's some other nationalities. So we're doing both stories, doing plays, helping on a feature film, but also building cases. So the idea is really, how do we fight for justice in all courts, the court of public opinion, legal courts, and so on and so forth, at the Royal Court in London, which is a theatre, all the courts. And the idea is, it comes from a sense of despair that I felt for a long time, and Janine felt, and Natalia, which is how do you close the gap between truth and justice? Because there's a lot of exposure that goes on of war crimes, probably more than in previous eras, but then there's no justice at the end of it. And that kind of makes it even worse, because then you have this culture of impunity where the powerful just sort of murder freely and then say, well, what you can do about it? So that's what we're really, inspired by. But one of the things I'm looking at in that is the legal culpability of Russian propagandists. But really thinking about it very much in a way, how can we show, or can we show, the sort of conscious integration of information operations into war crimes? Historically, that's very rarely happened. There's one case in Nuremberg, one in Rwanda, half of one in Yugoslavia. Usually propagandists get away with it because they say, hey, freedom of speech. And they say, hey, words have no meaning. They're just words. And in a way, for very good reasons, that has a very strong underpinning in international human rights law. There's no law about disinformation or something. That doesn't exist. And quite rightly, I think. I think what we're seeing in Russia is, or in this war, we saw it already in Syria, and again, we see it in many other cases, not to do with Russia across the world, is the digital traces that are left allow us to see the extent to which information is integrated into military operations.
Maybe much more so than in the past.
Well, we can see it much more. They can't say, oh, we were just saying our opinion, when 1,000 Telegram accounts say exactly the same thing a minute after, or in some cases they mess up, a minute before an attack. So one of the cases we're looking at is an attack on the Kramatorsk railway station, full of refugees fleeing sort of the hottest point of the war last year. 60 people died, women and children, refugees. And they hit a railway station at peak hour. The Russians, I mean. And again, we're only just starting to research this, but the story that the Ukrainians did it themselves, or something like that, they started it a few minutes before the attack. So stuff like that makes you go, well, no, I'm sorry, this is not freedom of speech. This is a completely calculated information operation where everybody, and here's the trick, can we prove that they're aware of what they're doing? Because you have to show they're aware of what they're doing. But anyway, I think we have a better chance than ever before. And look, I think one of the things that Orwell makes us realize is the violent power of propaganda, and how propaganda is integrated into oppression. And look, it's a really hard challenge, because of course we don't want to put freedom of speech at risk in any way. I actually agree with the sense that disinformation is not a legal term and shouldn't be, but we're talking about something else here. And delineating even the most abhorrent forms of speech, which is part of freedom of speech, and something which is a calculated, mass coordinated campaign acting as an information alibi during a war crime, I think we can differentiate that. I hope. Anyway, we're just starting. It's going to be very hard.
And the hope is to get indictments eventually?
Well, that's what the lawyers hope, because they want to be, because that's their lawyers. But we think about it. I think if we can change the public debate, then I think that's a huge thing. Make people more aware. It obviously then puts more pressure on tech companies. If the tech companies are hosting, the aiding and abetting of war crimes, that puts a lot more pressure on them to take much better care about what's happening on their platforms. Puts more pressure on advertisers who are still advertising on so-called TV stations that are part of these operations. So there's a lot of things that open up.
One of the dimensions that I think is really interesting kind of in all of your work is, let me see if I know how to put this into words. Well, I'll give a concrete example with what you do, Azmat. The war to contain ISIS, I think most Americans would think is a justified war. Mm-hmm. I think most Americans would think it's better to do the war from the air than on the ground or some other way. And yet, here you are examining and giving us some really inconvenient facts about a war that we are thinking of, if we're thinking about it at all, as a good war. And I'd actually like to hear from any of you about sort of how you navigate the really weird moral complexities of trying to see truth and share truth with the world in a where you realize that you could cause harm, what you learn could cause harm. It's actually sort of impossible to know where it goes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean that's a great point, and I'll start and then turn it over to you two. But two things come to mind. The first is that whether you're talking about a justified war or you're talking about not just the means but the lead up to it, that's a different question than do we know the facts of this war that is going on, right? So that we can be behind the idea of it, but can you truly have an informed debate about that war and be behind the idea of it if you don't know the reality of what's happening? So at the very most base level, there was just a wide gap between what we've been told and the reality on the ground. And a troubling example to kind of hone in on what you were describing was just that, I would have to dig through ISIS propaganda videos because ISIS kept a monopoly on who could have technologies to record videos and take photos and upload things to the internet. So oftentimes when I was on the ground verifying something, I would have to scour the web for anything that would corroborate what I was finding. And that included things like satellite imagery and before and after analysis of those. But it also meant that I had to watch tons of ISIS propaganda videos. And something that was disturbing to me that I did report, I did include, but it felt weird about, was that so often these ISIS propaganda videos that I was finding accurately had the numbers of dead that I was able to verify. And it was bizarre to me. They would be 12 were killed, and I would find 11 or 13 or something, almost precisely the same number. And so I included that, but obviously, I also included the brutalities of ISIS, that sort of thing. And then on the second level, the second thing that occurred to me as you were describing this was that it's not just about this particular war, it's about what this shift overall to aerial campaigns means. Yes, it means that fewer Americans are dying in our wars, and that is a very good thing. But what that shift also means is that, if you look historically at what has curbed or ended wars in the United States, it's often been because Americans were coming home in body bags. And we had a political cost that we were paying beyond just the costs, the monetary costs of those wars. We were paying with lives. And you saw it most when we had a draft. You saw it less, but still there, when we deployed in the aughts to Iraq and Afghanistan. But when you create the kind of asymmetry that we have today, where we can conduct these wars with very little debate. Very few American deaths. More Americans died in the war against ISIS from suicide than in hostile death, right? When you take that out of the equation, this one curtailing political cost from those wars, what you have is wars that can be started with a push of a button, with very little debate, with very little discussion, with very little independent oversight. Like, fewer American troops on the ground also mean fewer embeds, fewer reporters on the ground in these areas. It means that we get less of an accurate understanding of what's happening, less critical analysis, less debate, and a means to just keep these continuing endlessly until there is some bold decision, like in Afghanistan, whether or not you agree with the departure from that, right? But at some point, how do these wars end? And it's worth thinking about. So it's not just about a good or bad war, it's that shift and what it means.
Barbara, Peter, anything to say about that? Or we can take some questions from the audience. Barbara.
I'll just say very quickly, because that's beautifully said. I don't have that much to ask. I mean, I think, part of the inspiration for writing my North Korea book, Nothing to Envy, was sort of, presenting as best I could, on the ground North Korea, and, creating that sometimes hard to see distinction between the North Korean government and the North Korean people. And there was always like a lot of talk, like, why can't we just bomb these guys? Like, just to get rid of them. And a lot of the imagery of North Koreans in the West were these, automatons goose-stepping to their leadership, and it was, kind of racist, inscrutable Asians kind of stuff. And, when I actually started talking to North Koreans, yes, they were defectors, but a lot of them weren't really political people. I mean, one thinks that people defect because of, some great desire to, use Facebook or,
These were people trying to avoid starving to death.
They were people, yeah. And some of them came out sort of accidentally and then stayed out. They were just such a cliche, so much like us, so much like us. I'm very, very easy to understand their motivations. And, one comes to understand when you interview people in these kind of political systems that if you were living in this system where every input you got, every signal was propaganda, you'd be just the same. And it's a question that I try to pose to readers of my books, like, what would you do in this situation?
I think we have time for maybe two pretty quick questions. If we have a mic in the audience. Do we have a mic in the audience? Okay, great. I'm done questioning.
Hey, thank you all so much for your work. My question is for Peter. I was a couple of months ago. There was a video that came out of Russia that was meant to show the Ukrainians trying to kill Putin, and it was like an explosion right over the Kremlin. And there were guys standing on the roof, and it just looked so sort of amateurish and obviously fake. And I'm curious about how, and you see it with Trump too, where he says things that are so obviously wrong. And it almost sort of becomes the point, sort of like the crappiness of the propaganda. And I'm curious sort of the dynamic in which propaganda works almost not being convincing somehow becomes a strength of it or something like that. And I was hoping, Peter, you could sort of talk a little bit about the way propaganda works by not always being that convincing, but somehow that is more effective.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of thinking about this. There's even a philosopher called Michael Lynch who tries to sort of philosophically define this, the difference between Harry Frankfurter's idea of bullshitting, which is kind of saying anything that'll get you through, and what he calls barefaced lying, the strength of which comes from sort of saying, I don't care about reality. I am so full of power and disdain for reality that I will lie openly. For example, it's raining. Everyone can see it's raining. You're like, I don't care, it's not raining. So Putin does this a lot. I mean, there's this very famous case in the 2014 invasion of Ukraine when there were all these kind of like sort of Russian soldiers, but with the insignia off, with sort of Russian weapons, taking over Crimea. And he was asked by a journalist, this was broadcast internationally, are there Russian soldiers in Crimea? And he's like, no, sort of smiles. And he goes, what about these soldiers with Russian weapons? They got them at a local store. And it's kind of saying that you don't care. You're powerful, therefore you get to define reality. And that sort of strips away the ground for any opposition because we use facts to sort of fight back. We collect facts. We're meant to think that the powerful are scared of the truth. I mean, the credo of, especially the sort of journalism that you guys do, the real journalism, not the sort of reality shows I made, was to hold truth to power. It's meant to be like garlic you hold up to a vampire, and here the vampire's like taking the garlic and eating it and going, yummy. And it asks very big questions about what is it that we all do? I mean, what is the point of finding the facts? What is the point of finding the truth? So they're making an argument that way. If you get even more into the weeds of propaganda theory, and this may be something that Orwell got wrong. Are we allowed to say that? So sometimes propaganda is about messaging, it's about persuasion. That's often how we think about it, like brainwashing something, this really silly term that I am as allergic to as you are to Orwellian. When often it's not about that. Often it's about signaling. Often it's about communicating a message saying, this is the reality that you have to say you believe in if you want to not get in trouble and profit from the system. And in that sense, the more absurd you make it, the better. The classic study of this is Lisa Wedin, amazing anthropologist about Syria, about Assad's father. I've forgotten the name of the book. I quote it in my book. Another little plug for my own book. And she's sort of talking about how in the Syria of Hafez Assad, there's these ridiculous posters everywhere. Hafez Assad, the greatest dentist ever, and so on and so forth. And the point isn't that you're meant to believe it. The point is you're meant to repeat it in order to show that you are acquiescing to the system. And therefore, the more absurd it is, the more you show your acquiescence, the less risk you're in, the more loyalty you show, the more you can survive and progress. So that's a very, Orwell's all about forcing people to believe 2 + 2 = 5. Here it's not that at all. Here it's like, everybody's a conscious actor, everybody knows what's going on, everybody knows it's a game, it's a language, it's a series of codes that you have to show that you acquiesce to.
One more question, real quick though.
I have a question about when a story affects journalism. Just take the New York Times. After your extraordinary reporting on how often the State Department and the Pentagon lie, does that change the next time there's a press conference in those places or an unnamed source from those places, particularly around these issues of surgical strikes, which we've heard for so many decades?
It's so funny because for this book that I'm writing, I've had to go back through claims of precision over many, many wars. And if you go back to the Gulf War, same claims were being made. Years later, there would be maybe an accounting of that, like a Congressional Research Service report that was kept, classified for years and comes out and actually not that precise, all of these sorts of things. And even now with great technologies, a point I often make is that, you can hit the exact thing you want to hit very precisely and have the wrong thing if your intelligence is wrong. Like this technology is technology. And it's interesting because, and I publish so infrequently, honestly, it's like years between each project. And so when the civilian casualty files came out in late 2021, it landed, this was like the culmination of 5 years of work, and yes, there were like thousands of documents and all of these strikes that I'd went to comparing the documents to what was on the ground, and so they couldn't do that thing they normally do, which is, we'll open an investigation into this one airstrike. You have so many to look at, it's all out there for the world to see, and so they said, the director of the Defense Department, essentially said, I'm creating a new civilian casualty policy. I've ordered this. There's this timeline, and there is a Center for Excellence on Civilian Casualties that's going to be created. And even I think the spokesperson at the Department of Defense, when the Pulitzer was awarded, said something like, this forced us to ask hard truths. And, it sounded like a win, right? It sounded like progress. And yet, knowing what I do about, historically when progress has come, it's come from very particular things. It's come from the political costs I described. It's come from widespread anti-war movements. And it's often, it would be, frankly, what I've always said is that they should do what I'm doing. They should be on the ground. They should be doing this work. I shouldn't be doing it, and they don't, and they won't be doing it according to everything I've learned. And so that's not, in some ways it almost has taken the pressure off, right, by introducing the claims of this, but, I'm, I will be watching, I will continue reporting, so I'm not, I unless something happens to me, I will continue doing this work. So I plan on it, but I do think that, I've seen other journalists be really skeptical. After some of these things, I've seen people, take that, be a lot more cautious after the Kabul strike. But what results in true, lasting change is often something far bigger than any journalistic report, any investigation. It's people like all of you caring, massively caring, and doing something about it. So thank you for caring and coming today.
I want to thank this amazing panel, Barbara Demick, Azmat Khan, Peter Pomerantsev. Yes. Peter has party favors, but really valuable, important party favors.
These are like kind of like takeaway presents with a twist. So all of our colleague Yevhen Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal correspondent in Russia, has been arrested. As you probably know, he's in Lefortovo prison that in Moscow that has been home to sort of dissidents and opposition members for many centuries. He was arrested for no reason. Putin just wants him in order to trade with the very many Russian spies who are now being uncovered, sitting in lots of countries across the world. And it's happened like a month ago now, or more, probably more, and there's a huge risk that the story's going to get forgotten. So you can mark your support for somebody who's literally under Orwellian conditions, being sort of like arrested and shoved into a high security prison for no reason at all. And you can wear the little pin and don't, again, so much depends on you. All these things are always political. They're always political. I mean, it's all about public pressure, and it really is all about you. So it's your fault if it doesn't happen.
Thanks, everyone.